Well, well, well. Pleasant afternoon. Well, late afternoon. Pleasant for some. It's time to review the privatisation nightmare. That's right. Time to review the privatisation nightmare. Now, the interesting thing is when we first formed public interest before corporate interest in 2015, was the lack of understanding or even knowledge about what privatisation was, what the public sector was, what the private sector was. It was quite extraordinary, really. And to a significant degree, the message we heard over and over again was that private was better than public on every single indicator, because people judged their experiences in the public sector, whether it was public education or public hospital, with what was available in the private sector. Now, obviously, an underfunded and understaffed public health sector and an underfunded and understaffed public education sector will not be able to provide the same services as a private sector which is subsidised, and that's the key word, which is subsidised by the Australian taxpayer. Every public institution relies on taxpayers' funds to survive. Almost every private institution relies on investors, consumers, and most importantly of all, corporate welfare. And most people don't seem to understand the concept of the amount of resources which are allocated by the federal government and state governments to the private sector to provide services which are essential. Now, the idea of having essential services under public ownership is nothing new. The election of one of the first Labor governments in the world, in Australia in the 1910s, saw the state intervene in the private sector to provide access to resources which people could not access via the private sector, and financial services was a key example. The Commonwealth Bank was established as a government-owned bank in the 1910s, and it was established to provide financial support to individuals and businesses which could not access funds, loans, through the private banking system. It was also formed as a hedge against the collapse of private banks. In the 1890s, 20 years previously, we saw a collapse of a large number of privately owned banks in Australia, which resulted in the loss of millions of dollars of money, of depositors' money. So the idea, that's right, the idea of creating a Commonwealth Bank was to ensure that everybody, or almost everybody, had access to financial services. One of the first public institutions was created by the early federal government was the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. The influenza epidemic of 1919, which killed more Australians than World War I, and remember, over 62,000 young Australians died in World War I, fighting for the glory of God, King and country. The fact is, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was established to provide cover, to provide immunisation to the vast majority of people who wanted it. So what we saw over the next 50 years, 60 years, 50 to 60 years, was the Commonwealth government becoming more and more involved in financing, creating public institutions which were there to look after the interests of everyone. We saw this with the creation of a telecommunications industry which was publicly owned. Telecom was its name. We saw this with the creation of a airline company, Qantas, which was publicly owned. We saw this with the creation of energy production by publicly owned companies at the state and federal level. We saw this with the expansion of the public education sector. We saw it with the expansion of public hospitals. So what we had is a balance between the public and the private sector. Over the last 50 years, privatisation has been the name of the game. And it's been the name of the game, and most Australians have supported privatisation because people don't seem to understand that publicly owned institutions do not belong to the people. They belong to the government of the day. They don't belong to the people because they are not, their ownership is not incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So what we see is an increasing lack of understanding about the role the public sector played in everyday life in Australian society. What that means is that when governments began to privatise publicly owned assets, although there was some resistance, that resistance wasn't unified, and that resistance was overcome with state governments and the federal government passing legislation through Parliament which allowed them to sell assets which provided services and which had been built up through the use of billions of dollars of taxpayers' funds. So we saw the privatisation of telecommunications, we saw the privatisation of Qantas, we saw the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, we saw the privatisation of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. In many states we saw the privatisation of energy production facilities, and as we move into the late 20th century and early 21st century, we saw the privatisations, especially in Victoria, of public housing. We're seeing the privatisation of the Titles Office, the privatisation of many essential services, and they've been given over to the private sector. Now, why has this occurred? It hasn't occurred because privately managed and privately owned institutions are more efficient than well-funded public sector institutions. To a significant degree, they've been privatised because the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication and the corporate sector have starved both state and Commonwealth governments of finances. Now, what are the advantages of having publicly listed company? They come in there are many advantages which most people don't seem to understand and which most politicians don't seem to understand. The most important element of having a strong public sector in a mixed economy, and Australia was a mixed economy, is that it prevents the private sector from increasing prices and reducing services, because there is competition between the public and private sector, and individuals within the country can make up their minds which one they support. The fact is that when you remove a public institution in a particular field, for example, say telecom, and you privatise it, or the energy sector, what happens is, although there may be superficially increased competition, the fact is competition is greatly reduced. And when governments legislate to privatise essential services, what happens is that the overseen bodies which are created to ensure these private sector services provide services are underfunded and don't have the legislative power to control the private sector. So what we see is an escalation of prices and a decrease in services. Whether it's Qantas, whether it's the energy sector, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's the telecommunications sector, what we have seen is increasing profitability for shareholders and decreased services for consumers. So when you remove competition, real competition, in a mixed economy, the private sector does what it likes. We've seen this in the aged care sector, which is basically almost has been privatised. We see it in the early childhood development sector. We see issues arise because governments have not provided the legislative muscle and the staff to monitor these private services, and the disasters which have been outlined in Royal Commission after Royal Commission regarding the privatised aged care service and the privatised early childhood development services is legendary. We also see this to a significant degree in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where we have seen the private sector use this as a money-making concern and not providing the necessary services with people with major physical and intellectual disabilities in our community. And it's no wonder every time you watch a news bulletin or read social media or listen to radio that there is discussions about the expanding cost of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because although it's supposedly a national scheme, the fact is that it relies on the private sector to deliver those services, and the private sector, bloated by the profits that can be made, exploits the sector while not providing services to the people they supposedly look after. So here we have major issues around the country, major issues because of a lack of competition. The second thing we need to remember is that selling off a public asset is like killing the goose that lays the golden egg. Many of the public institutions which were sold by successive Labor and Liberal National Party governments, and let's not forget that Labor, the Australian Labor Party, commonly known as the Alternative Liberal Party, has been instrumental in pushing the privatisation agenda, especially in Victoria as far as public housing is concerned. But the fact is that many public institutions were profitable, and these profits could be used to expand the public institution, or they could go directly to the Treasury. The Victorian government steals almost $1 billion of profits which are made by the Transport Accident Commission, which was created to look after injured road users, into common revenue every year. Instead of using that excess revenue to expand its services, it raises revenue which it puts into its budgets. So the Commonwealth Bank was making a profit when it was privatised. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was privatised by the Keating Labor government for a share price of about $2.94. Currently, you need at least $250 to $300 to buy one share in the privatised Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. Telecommunications created profits. A lot of these profits could be funneled into public education and public health, which are systems which are not able to create profits. Even Medibank Private, which was privatised by the Abbott-led Liberal National Coalition, was making at least $100 to $150 million profits every year. So to say that public institutions and public services do not create a profit is wrong. Then finally, we have the ability of customers to influence government to improve services created by public institutions. Today, when we become involved in disputes with privatised companies which are supervised by government bodies which don't have the staff or the legislative ability to supervise them, it is almost impossible to get any satisfaction. It is almost impossible to change policy directions. Having essential services incorporated into government ownership allows electors to put pressure on government to change policies regarding various public services. So in 2026, it's time to review this nightmare. It is a nightmare. It may not be a nightmare for people who've got enough money to buy the best education money can buy and the best healthcare money can buy, because these services are subsidised by taxpayer funds at the expense of the public institutions regarding health and education. But the fact is that allowing this travesty to occur will continue to result in the same problems. A mixed economy can only work if there is a strong public sector, publicly owned. More importantly, in the struggle to create new public institutions, whether it's through the nationalisation, that's right, nationalisations of this country's mineral resources, placing their ownership back in public hands so there'll be enough resources for everyone in this country. The fact is that if we want to create new public institutions, their ownership must be incorporated into the Australian Constitution. Then and only then will important, essential public institutions which provide essential public services to the community at large, to the public, will be in a position to resist any attempts by governments at the state and federal level to privatise them because they have some type of temporary budgetary black hole. So it's time we turned our attention back to the creation of public institutions in this country, because they are able to overcome many of the difficulties which you've outlined. One, access to services, equitable access to services. Two, increased competition. Three, the ability to determine their direction through people's ability to change governments. And four, the creation of a revenue stream which goes to the federal treasury, which can then cross-subsidise sectors like the education sector and the healthcare sector, which are not designed to create profits. So the ball once again is in your court. Initially it's about debate, eventually it's about action. Without debate, there is no action. Currently, as we see in Victoria, there is debate and action regarding the privatisation of public housing. Unfortunately, most people have no interest in this debate because they somehow think it has no impact on them. Unfortunately, it has an impact. Public housing is everybody's business, and is everybody's business for a number of reasons. Because without an adequate public housing sector, we have increasing dislocation, increasing crime, increasing issues in our community. We have more and more people wasting their income on rent and unnecessarily high property prices which they need to pay through their mortgages. Once again, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest. It's very simple. Go to the website pibci.net, pibci.net. Join today and join a movement which is against and continues to agitate against the privatisation of every aspect of our existence in the 2026.